The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Benning as Sarah Martinez adjusted her gear for what she thought would be just another training exercise. The Georgia heat was already building, promising another scorching day that would test every recruit's limits. Sarah had been preparing for this moment for months, ever since she made the decision to join the Army and prove that she belonged in a world dominated by men who questioned her every move. At 22, Sarah carried herself with the quiet determination of someone who had fought for everything she ever earned. Growing up in East Los Angeles, she learned early that respect wasn't given. It was taken, one small victory at a time. Her father had worked double shifts at the factory to keep their family afloat, while her mother cleaned office buildings at night to make ends meet. Sarah watched them sacrifice everything for their children's future, and she promised herself she would honor that sacrifice by becoming something more than anyone expected. The decision to enlist came after 2 years of community college, where she studied criminal justice while working part-time at a local gym. She could have continued down that path, maybe become a police officer in her hometown, but something inside her yearned for more. The military offered structure, purpose, and a chance to serve something bigger than herself. It also offered a way to prove that a girl from the barrio could stand shoulder to shoulder with anyone. Her recruiter, Staff Sergeant Williams, had been honest about the challenges she would face. "You're going to be tested every day," he told her during their first meeting. "Not just physically, but mentally. Some people won't want you to succeed simply because you're different. The question is, how badly do you want this?" Sarah's answer had been immediate and unwavering. She wanted it more than anything she had ever wanted in her life. Basic training had been everything the sergeant promised, and more. The physical demands pushed her to limits she didn't know existed, but she met every challenge. The mental pressure was constant. Drill instructors who seemed to take pleasure in finding her weakest moments and exploiting them. But Sarah endured because she had learned something important growing up in a tough neighborhood. Sometimes survival meant outlasting everyone who wanted to see you fail. She graduated basic training in the top 10% of her class, earning the respect of instructors who had initially doubted her ability to keep up. Her physical fitness scores were among the highest, and her marksmanship qualified her as expert level. For the first time since enlisting, Sarah allowed herself to believe she had made the right choice. Advanced individual training brought new challenges and new opportunities to prove herself. Sarah had chosen military police as her specialty, drawn to the law enforcement aspect and the responsibility that came with it. The training was intensive, covering everything from combat tactics to legal procedures, from crowd control to investigation techniques. It was during this phase that she first encountered Sergeant First Class Marcus Thompson, the instructor who would change the trajectory of her military career in ways she could never have imagined. Thompson was everything Sarah expected from a senior drill instructor: tough, demanding, and absolutely uncompromising in his standards. He stood 6 feet tall, with the lean, muscular build of someone who had spent years pushing his body to its limits. His dark eyes seemed to see everything, missing no detail, no shortcut, no moment of weakness. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had earned respect through action, not rank alone. What Sarah didn't expect was the way Thompson seemed to single her out from the very first day of his instruction. "Martinez," he barked during their first formation, his eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her stomach tighten. "Step forward." Sarah moved with precision, her boots clicking against the concrete as she took her position front and center. Around her, she could feel the eyes of her fellow trainees, some sympathetic, others curious about what was about to unfold. Thompson walked slowly around her, his gaze never wavering, like a predator studying prey. "Where you from, recruit?" "Los Angeles, California, drill sergeant," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through her. "Los Angeles," Thompson repeated, his tone dripping with something Sarah couldn't quite identify. "Gang territory. Rough neighborhoods. I bet you think you're tough because you grew up on those streets." Sarah felt her jaw tighten, but kept her expression neutral. "No excuse, drill sergeant. I'm here to serve my country." Thompson stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the small scar that ran along his left temple. Country doesn't care where you're from, Martinez. Country doesn't care about your sob story or how hard you think you had it. Country cares about one thing. Can you do the job when everything goes to hell? Yes, drill sergeant, Sarah responded without hesitation. We'll see about that, Thompson said, stepping back with what might have been a smile if it hadn't looked so cold. We'll definitely see about that. Over the following weeks, Thompson made it clear that Sarah would receive no special treatment. In fact, she seemed to receive the opposite. While other recruits struggled through standard exercises, Sarah found herself facing additional challenges, longer runs, more complex scenarios. When the company practiced riot control techniques, Thompson always chose her to play the role of the unruly civilian who needed to be subdued. During hand-to-hand combat training, he paired her with larger, stronger opponents, forcing her to rely on technique and speed rather than brute force. When they practiced building, clearing exercises, he placed her in the most difficult positions, often as the point person entering potentially hostile rooms. Sarah's fellow trainees began to notice the pattern. Some offered sympathy, suggesting she file a complaint about unfair treatment. Others kept their distance, worried that associating with her might bring Thompson's extra attention their way. A few seemed to enjoy watching her struggle, seeing her difficulties as confirmation that women didn't belong in combat roles. Through it all, Sarah refused to break. She met every challenge Thompson threw at her. Even when she was exhausted, even when her muscles screamed in protest, even when doubt crept in her mind during the long, sleepless nights. She had come too far to quit now, and she was determined to prove that she deserved to wear the uniform. The other recruits in her training company represented a cross-section of America. Farm boy from the Midwest, city kids from the East Coast, young men and women from small towns scattered across the country. Most were recent high school graduates looking for direction, college money, or a chance to serve their country. Some came from military families, following in the footsteps of fathers and grandfathers who had worn the uniform. Others, like Sarah, were first-generation soldiers seeking to create a new path for themselves and their families. Among her peers, Sarah found both allies and adversaries. There was Jessica Chun, a soft-spoken recruit from Oregon whose quiet demeanor hid remarkable determination. Jessica had joined the military to pay for medical school, but she approached every training exercise with the focus of a surgeon. She and Sarah often studied together, helping each other through the complex legal procedures they were required to memorize. Then, there was Michael Rodriguez from Texas, whose easy smile and natural leadership ability made him popular with both instructors and fellow recruits. Michael had grown up on a ranch, and his understanding of hard work and responsibility translated well to military life. He was one of the few recruits who seemed genuinely unconcerned about Sarah's presence, treating her as just another soldier rather than an anomaly to be either protected or resented. On the other end of the spectrum was David Foster, a recruit from Ohio whose father had served as a Marine in Vietnam. David made no secret of his belief that women had no place in combat roles, and he watched Sarah's training with barely concealed hostility. He never directly confronted her, but his comments and attitudes created an undercurrent of tension that other recruits couldn't ignore. The dynamics between these personalities created a complex social environment that Sarah had to navigate carefully. She needed to prove herself worthy of respect without appearing to seek special attention. She had to be tough without being aggressive, confident without being arrogant. Every interaction was a delicate balance between fitting in and standing out for the right reasons. Thompson seemed to understand these dynamics better than anyone, and he used them as another tool in Sarah's training. During group exercises, he would deliberately create situations where Sarah had to assert leadership over reluctant male recruits. He forced her to make split-second decisions under pressure, often in scenarios where there was no clearly correct answer. One particularly challenging exercise took place during the 5th week of training. The company was practicing crowd control in a simulated riot situation, with half the recruits playing angry protesters and the other half acting as military police attempting to maintain order. Sarah found herself designated as the team leader responsible for clearing a path through the crowd to reach a wounded soldier who needed medical evacuation. The scenario was designed to be chaotic and stressful, with smoke machines creating limited visibility and speakers blasting the sounds of an angry mob. The recruits playing protesters have been instructed to be as realistic as possible, shouting threats and epithets while pressing against the police line. As Sarah tried to coordinate her team's movement through the simulated crowd, Thompson's voice cut through the chaos. "Martinez, your team is moving too slow. That soldier is bleeding out while you're playing patty cake with these protesters." Sarah felt her frustration rising, but forced herself to stay focused. She adjusted her team's formation, using shields to create a wedge that could push through the crowd more effectively. But just as they were making progress, one of the protesters, played by David Foster, grabbed her baton and tried to wrestle it away. The move was unexpected and aggressive, going beyond what the exercise called for. Sarah found herself in a real struggle for control of her weapon, with Foster using his size advantage to try to overpower her. Around them, the exercise continued, but other recruits had begun to notice the genuine conflict developing. "Get off my weapon," Sarah shouted, trying to use the techniques she had been taught to regain control. Foster's response was loud enough for everyone to hear. "Make me Barrio girl." The ethnic slur hit Sarah like a physical blow, but it also triggered something deeper, the same anger that had driven her to excel in everything she attempted, the same determination that had brought her this far. Instead of pulling back, she stepped forward, using Foster's own momentum against him to break his grip on the baton. The maneuver worked perfectly, sending Foster stumbling backward into the crowd of protesters. But as he regained his balance, his expression shifted from surprise to genuine anger, and Sarah realized that what had started as an exercise was about to become something much more serious. Thompson's whistle cut through the air, signaling the end of the exercise, but the tension between Sarah and Foster remained. Other recruits formed a loose circle around them, sensing that the confrontation was far from over. "Problem here?" Thompson asked, his voice deceptively calm as he approached. Foster straightened his gear, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "No problem, drill sergeant. Just a realistic exercise." "Martinez." Thompson's attention shifted to Sarah. "Anything to add?" Sarah considered her options carefully. She could report Foster's inappropriate comment, but that would mark her as someone who couldn't handle conflict on her own. She could escalate the physical confrontation, but that would play into stereotypes about women being too emotional for military service. Or she could let it go and hope that Foster's behavior didn't escalate further. "No problem, drill sergeant," she said finally. "Just training hard." Thompson's eyes moved between Sarah and Foster for a long moment before he nodded. "Outstanding. That kind of intensity is exactly what we need." "Foster, Martinez, you both performed well under pressure. The rest of you could learn something from their commitment." As the company dispersed to prepare for the next exercise, Sarah felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her. Some of her fellow recruits looked at her with new respect, impressed by how she had handled herself against a larger opponent. Others seemed disappointed that the confrontation hadn't escalated further, cheated of the drama they had hoped to witness. But it was Thompson's expression that concerned her most. There was something in his eyes that suggested this incident was exactly what he had been waiting for, exactly the kind of test he had been building toward. And Sarah had the unsettling feeling that she had just passed one test only to find herself facing an even more difficult one. The following morning brought an unexpected announcement that would change everything for Sarah and her training company. As they stood in formation outside the barracks, Thompson emerged from the orderly room with an expression more serious than usual. Behind him walked a man Sarah had never seen before, older than Thompson, with steel-gray hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades in uniform. "Company, attention!" Thompson's voice carried across the formation with its usual authority. "We have a special guest today. This is Command Sergeant Major Harrison from Special Operations Command. He's here to observe your training and evaluate your potential for advanced military police duties." Sarah felt her heart rate increase. Special Operations Command meant elite units, the kind of assignments that could define a military career. She had heard rumors about special selection programs for military police who showed exceptional promise, opportunities to work alongside the military's most elite units. The possibility that she might be considered for such a program had never occurred to her. Harrison stepped forward, his eyes sweeping across the formation with the practiced gaze of someone who had seen thousands of soldiers and could assess their potential at a glance. When his gaze reached Sarah, it lingered for a moment longer than she expected, though his expression gave away nothing. "Today's exercise will be different," Harrison announced, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had earned respect through decades of service. "You'll be participating in a stress inoculation drill designed to test your ability to function under extreme pressure. This is not a game. This is not a standard training exercise. This is an evaluation of your potential to serve in situations where failure means people die." Thompson took over the briefing, explaining that the company would be divided into teams of 4, each tasked with navigating a complex scenario involving multiple threats, time pressure, and incomplete information. The exercise would take place in a mock urban environment constructed specifically for this type of training, a maze of buildings, alleyways, and obstacles designed to replicate the challenges of real-world operations. Each team will have 30 minutes to locate and secure a high-value target while avoiding or neutralizing multiple threats, Thompson continued. "You'll be equipped with simulation weapons and protective gear, but make no mistake, this exercise will push you to your physical and mental limits." As the company was divided into teams, Sarah found herself grouped with Jessica Chun, Michael Rodriguez, and, much to her dismay, David Foster. The combination seemed almost deliberately designed to test group dynamics under stress, pairing compatible personalities with potential sources of conflict. Foster's reaction to the team assignment was immediate and predictable. "Great," he muttered, just loud enough for Sarah to hear. "Now I have to babysit while trying to complete the mission." Sarah felt her jaw tighten, but forced herself to remain professional. She had dealt with Foster's attitude for weeks, and she wasn't about to let it affect her performance during such an important evaluation. Michael Rodriguez, as usual, stepped in to diffuse the tension. "We all want to succeed here," he said, addressing the group as a whole. "Let's focus on the mission and worry about personalities later." Jessica Chun nodded in agreement, though Sarah could see the concern in her eyes. Like Sarah, Jessica understood that their performance during this exercise could determine their future opportunities in military. Unlike the male recruits, they couldn't afford to have an off day or let personality conflicts affect their effectiveness. The urban training facility was more impressive than anything Sarah had seen during her military training. Multiple buildings rose 3 and 4 stories high, connected by catwalks and bridges that created a three-dimensional maze. Smoke machines filled certain areas with realistic haze, while speakers hidden throughout the facility provided background noise designed to replicate the chaos of urban combat. As the teams prepared to enter the facility, Thompson pulled Sarah aside for what appeared to be a routine equipment check. But his words were anything but routine. "This is your moment, Martinez," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Everything you've done up to this point has been preparation for this. Command Sergeant Major Harrison specifically requested to see you perform under pressure. Don't let me down." Sarah felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. The fact that Harrison had specifically asked to observe her suggested that her previous performance had been noted at the highest levels. But it also meant that the pressure she was feeling was real. This exercise could determine whether she had a future in elite military police units or would be assigned to routine security duties. "Roger, Drill Sergeant," she replied. "I won't let you down." Thompson nodded and stepped back, but something in his expression made Sarah uneasy. There was an intensity there that went beyond normal concern for a recruit's performance, something that suggested the stakes of this exercise were even higher than she realized. The exercise began with each team entering the facility from different points, following routes that would eventually converge on the target building. Sarah's team started from the eastern entrance, moving through a series of narrow alleyways designed to limit visibility and force careful coordination. Sarah took point, using hand signals to communicate with her team as they advanced through the maze-like environment. The simulation weapons felt different from their training rifles. Heavier, more realistic, with actual recoil when fired. The protective gear was more comprehensive than usual, including full-face shields and body armor that restricted movement but provided protection from the simulation rounds. Their first challenge came within minutes of entering the facility. As they rounded a corner, they encountered two enemy personnel, instructors equipped with simulation weapons and positioned to create maximum tactical difficulty. The engagement was brief but intense, requiring Sarah's team to coordinate their movements and use cover effectively to neutralize the threat. Foster performed adequately during the engagement, but Sarah noticed that he hesitated to follow her directions, always taking an extra moment to confirm orders with Michael Rodriguez before complying. The delay was subtle but noticeable, and in a real combat situation, it could have been fatal. As they continued through the facility, the challenges became more complex. They encountered civilians who needed to be protected while still pursuing their primary objective. They faced booby traps that required careful reconnaissance to detect and avoid. They dealt with time pressure as updates from exercise controllers informed them that their target was preparing to escape. Jessica Chun proved to be an invaluable team member, her careful attention to detail helping them avoid several traps that other teams would later stumble into. Michael Rodriguez's natural leadership abilities complemented Sarah's tactical skills, creating an effective partnership that allowed them to move through the facility efficiently. But it was Foster's behavior that concerned Sarah most. As the exercise progressed and pressure mounted, his resistance to her leadership became more pronounced. During a particularly challenging room clearing operation, he openly questioned her tactical decisions in front of the entire team. "We should go through the window, not the door," he said, pointing to an alternative entry point. "Sarah's way is going to get us all killed." The use of her first name instead of her rank or position as team leader was a deliberate slight that everyone noticed. In the military, such informality was reserved for close friends or used as an insult to diminish someone's authority. Sarah felt anger rising, but forced herself to remain calm. Negative. The window approach exposes us to fire from multiple angles. We use the door with proper covering fire. Foster's response was immediate and loud enough to be heard by instructors monitoring the exercise. "You're making the wrong choice, just like you always do. Someone's going to get hurt because you're too stubborn to listen." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah realized that this moment would define not just her performance in the exercise, but her future relationship with Foster and possibly other members of her unit. She could back down, possibly preserving team unity, but undermining her own authority. Or she could assert her leadership, risking further conflict, but maintaining the chain of command that was essential to military operations. "Foster," she said, her voice carrying the authority she had been developing throughout her training. "Fall in line or fall behind. We're executing this entry according to my plan." For a moment, the tension was so thick it seemed to stop time. Foster's face cycled through several emotions: anger, frustration, and something that might have been respect. Finally, he nodded curtly and took his assigned position. The room clearing operation went flawlessly, with Foster performing his role professionally despite his earlier objections. As they secured the space and prepared to move toward their final objective, Sarah felt a measure of satisfaction. She had asserted her authority without losing her temper, and the team had remained functional despite the personality conflict. But her satisfaction was short-lived. As they approached the target building, a 3-story structure designed to replicate a government facility or military installation, Thompson's voice crackled through their radio communications. "All teams be advised. Intelligence indicates the target has been moved to a more secure location within the building. You have 15 minutes to locate and secure the target before backup arrives. Exercise controllers will be increasing the difficulty level accordingly." The announcement was followed by the sound of increased gunfire from within the facility, suggesting that other teams were encountering heavier resistance as the exercise reached its climax. Sarah could feel her team's tension increasing, the knowledge that they were being watched and evaluated adding pressure to an already challenging situation. As they prepared to enter the target building, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. Through a window on the second floor, she caught a glimpse of Thompson standing with Harrison and several other senior instructors. They were watching the exercise unfold, but more importantly, they were watching her team specifically. The realization that she was under such intense scrutiny added a new dimension to the pressure she was already feeling. This wasn't just about completing the exercise successfully, it was about demonstrating the kind of leadership and tactical ability that would qualify her for special operations support roles. The ground floor of the building was dark and filled with smoke, forcing the team to rely on tactical lights mounted on their weapons to navigate. Sarah led them through a systematic clearing process, checking each room for threats while maintaining security on their flanks and rear. It was in the third room they cleared that everything went wrong. As Sarah moved through the doorway, following proper clearing procedures, she was met by a scenario designed to test her decision-making under extreme stress. A figure emerged from behind cover, clearly an instructor playing an enemy role, but between Sarah and the threat stood another figure that could have been either a civilian hostage or another threat. The situation required split-second analysis and decision-making. Sarah had to determine whether the figure was friendly or hostile, whether taking the shot would endanger an innocent person, and whether hesitating would allow a real threat to engage her team. She made her choice in a fraction of a second, deciding that the risk to the potential civilian was too great to justify an immediate shot. Instead, she called out a warning and attempted to maneuver for a better angle of fire. It was the wrong choice. The civilian immediately revealed himself to be another instructor playing a hostile role, raising a simulation weapon toward Sarah's team. At the same time, the original threat engaged from his covered position, creating a crossfire situation that caught Sarah's team in a deadly tactical trap. The simulation rounds hit all 4 team members within seconds, with sensors on their protective gear registering fatal hits that effectively ended their participation in the exercise. Red lights on their equipment began flashing, indicating that they had been eliminated from the scenario. Thompson's voice came through their radios immediately. Team 4, you are casualties. Exit the building and report for after-action review. As Sarah led her team out of the building, she felt the weight of failure settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She had made the wrong tactical choice, prioritizing a potential civilian over the safety of her team. In a real combat situation, that choice would have resulted in the deaths of 4 American soldiers. But worse than the tactical failure was the knowledge that her performance had been witnessed by Command Sergeant Major Harrison and other senior leaders who were evaluating her potential for advanced assignments. She had been given an opportunity to demonstrate exceptional ability, and instead, she had demonstrated poor judgment under pressure. Foster's reaction was immediate and predictable. As they exited the building and moved toward the debriefing area, he made sure his voice carried to other teams and instructors nearby. "I told you it was the wrong choice," he said, his tone mixing anger with vindication. "I told you someone was going to get hurt, and you didn't listen. Now we all failed because of your bad decision." Sarah felt every word like a physical blow, not just because of the public nature of Foster's criticism, but because she knew there was truth in what he was saying. She had made the wrong choice, and it had cost her team their chance to succeed in the exercise. Jessica Chun and Michael Rodriguez remained supportively silent, but Sarah could see the disappointment in their eyes. They had all wanted to succeed, and her poor decision-making had denied them that opportunity. As they approached the debriefing area where other teams were gathering, Sarah realized that this moment would define how her peers and superiors viewed her for the rest of her military career. She had been tested under pressure and found wanting, and now she would have to live with the consequences of her failure. The debriefing area buzzed with a nervous energy of soldiers who had just completed an intense evaluation. Teams clustered together, sharing their experiences and comparing their performance, while instructors moved between groups taking notes and preparing for the formal after-action review that would follow. Sarah stood with her team in uncomfortable silence, each member processing the failure in their own way. Jessica Chun stared at the ground, her usual composure cracked by the disappointment of not measuring up to her own high standards. Michael Rodriguez kept glancing between Sarah and Foster, clearly wrestling with the team dynamics that had contributed to their poor performance. Foster made no effort to hide his anger and frustration. He stood slightly apart from the group, his body language broadcasting his displeasure to anyone who cared to observe. When other recruits approached to ask how his team had performed, his answers were loud enough for Sarah to hear every word. "We had the target building secured until our team leader made a panicked decision," he told a group of recruits from Team 2. "Hesitated when she should have taken the shot. Got the whole team killed because she couldn't handle the pressure." Each repetition of the story felt like another weight added to Sarah's shoulders. She knew that by the end of the day, every recruit in the company would know that she had failed under pressure, that she had made the wrong choice when it mattered most. The reputation she had built through weeks of consistent performance was being destroyed in real time, reduced to a single moment of poor judgment. Command Sergeant Major Harrison appeared at the edge of the debriefing area, moving between teams with the measured pace of someone conducting serious evaluations. When he stopped to speak with other teams, his conversations were brief and professional. When he reached successful teams, Sarah noticed that his exchanges lasted longer, suggesting more detailed discussions about performance and potential opportunities. Thompson approached Sarah's team with a clipboard and the kind of expression that suggested the formal debriefing would be even more uncomfortable than the informal aftermath they were already experiencing. His eyes met Sarah's briefly, and she saw something that might have been disappointment or perhaps something else entirely. Team 4, report to Conference Room B for after-action review, Thompson announced. Individual evaluations will follow team debriefing. As they walked toward the designated room, Sarah felt the eyes of other recruits following them. News of their failure had spread quickly through the small community of the training company, and everyone was curious to see how the aftermath would unfold. Some faces showed sympathy, particularly from recruits who had struggled with their own challenges during training. Others displayed the kind of barely concealed satisfaction that comes from watching someone else fail, especially someone who had previously been performing at a high level. Conference Room B was a sterile space designed for serious military business. White walls, fluorescent lighting, and a rectangular table surrounded by uncomfortable metal chairs. Thompson entered behind them and gestured for the team to take seats facing a large screen that would presumably be used to replay critical moments from their exercise performance. "Before we begin the formal review," Thompson said, settling into his chair with deliberate precision, "I want each team member to provide their assessment of what went wrong during the final engagement. Foster, start us off." Foster straightened in his chair, clearly prepared for this moment. "Drill Sergeant, our team leader made a tactical error that resulted in the entire team being eliminated. When we encountered the civilian threat scenario, she hesitated instead of taking decisive action. I attempted to provide alternative tactical input during the exercise, but my recommendations were not accepted." Sarah felt her cheeks burn with humiliation as Foster's clinical description reduced her leadership to a series of poor decisions and missed opportunities. The worst part was knowing that his assessment was largely accurate. She had hesitated, and that hesitation had cost them everything. "Rodriguez," Thompson continued, "your assessment." Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair before responding. "Drill Sergeant, the scenario presented a difficult tactical situation with no clearly correct answer. Our team leader attempted to minimize civilian casualties, which is consistent with rules of engagement. However, the decision proved tactically disadvantageous given the specific threat configuration." Sarah appreciated Michael's attempt to provide context for her decision, but she could hear the diplomatic language he was using to avoid directly criticizing her performance. His careful phrasing only emphasized how badly she had performed. "Chun." Thompson's attention moved to Jessica, who had remained silent since their elimination from the exercise. Jessica took a breath before responding. "Drill Sergeant, the team communicated effectively throughout most of the exercise. The final engagement presented a complex scenario that required rapid decision-making under pressure. The outcome was unfortunate, but The team maintained proper procedures until the point of elimination. Again, Sarah heard the careful language designed to avoid direct criticism while acknowledging the reality of their failure. Jessica's loyalty was touching, but it couldn't change the fundamental facts of what had happened. Martinez, Thompson said finally, his voice carrying an intensity that made Sarah straighten in her chair. Your assessment of your performance and leadership during this exercise. Sarah knew that this moment was crucial, not just for the formal evaluation, but for her future relationship with Thompson and her potential for military advancement. She could make excuses, blame the scenario design, or point to the successful completion of earlier phases of the exercise. But she had been taught that military leadership required taking responsibility for both success and failure. Drill Sergeant, I made a tactical error that resulted in the elimination of my team from the exercise. When faced with the civilian threat scenario, I prioritized civilian protection over immediate threat neutralization. This decision proved incorrect given the specific configuration of threats we encountered. I take full responsibility for the team's failure to complete the mission successfully. Thompson nodded slowly, making notes on his clipboard. At least you understand the magnitude of your error. Let's review the engagement in detail. The screen at the front of the room came to life, showing a bird's-eye view of the target building with digital overlays indicating the positions of Sarah's team and the various threats they had encountered. The replay was even more painful to watch than living through the original experience, as the tactical errors became obvious when viewed from an omniscient perspective. Here, Thompson said, pausing the video as Sarah's team approached the final room. Your team is in good tactical position. You have proper spacing, appropriate cover, and good communication. Your movement to this point has been textbook military police procedure. The praise made the coming criticism even harder to bear, as Sarah watched her digital representation prepare to make the decision that would doom her team. And here, Thompson continued, advancing the video to the moment of contact. Everything falls apart. Martinez, walk us through your decision-making process. Sarah forced herself to watch as her digital avatar hesitated in the doorway, weapon raised but not firing. I identified two potential threats, but one appeared to be a civilian or hostage. I attempted to issue verbal commands to determine the nature of the threat before engaging. Time from initial contact to verbal command, Thompson asked, consulting additional data on his screen. 2.3 seconds, Drill Sergeant. 2.3 seconds, Thompson repeated. In a close-quarters combat situation, how long does it take a trained operator to acquire and engage multiple targets? Sarah knew the answer from her training, and it made her feel sick. Approximately 1 second per target, Drill Sergeant. Exactly. While you spent 2.3 seconds analyzing the situation, a trained enemy could have engaged and eliminated your entire team, which, as we can see from the exercise results, is exactly what happened. The video continued, showing the engagement from multiple angles. Sarah watched her team fall one by one as the scenario played out exactly as Thompson had predicted. Foster's digital representation was the last to be eliminated, and even in the recording, his body language clearly expressed frustration and anger. Foster, Thompson said, pausing the video again, during the exercise, you expressed disagreement with several of Martinez's tactical decisions. Elaborate on your concerns. Foster sat up straighter, clearly pleased to have his tactical judgment validated. Drill Sergeant, throughout the exercise, Martinez consistently chose overly cautious approaches that prioritized minimal risk over mission completion. During the window versus door discussion, her choice of entry point was tactically sound but operationally slower. During the final engagement, her hesitation to engage apparent threats reflected a pattern of indecisive leadership under pressure. Each word hit Sarah like a physical blow, not just because of their harshness, but because she recognized the truth in Foster's assessment. She had been cautious, perhaps overly so, and that caution had indeed contributed to their failure. Thompson turned his attention back to Sarah. Martinez, how do you respond to Foster's assessment of your leadership style? Sarah considered her options carefully. She could defend her decisions, argue that caution was appropriate in complex scenarios, or point to successful aspects of her leadership during earlier phases of the exercise. But she was beginning to understand that this debriefing was about more than just analyzing a single failed exercise. It was about determining whether she had the fundamental qualities necessary for military police leadership. Drill Sergeant, Foster's assessment contains valid points about my decision-making under pressure. I believe my tactical choices were reasonable given the information available, but I acknowledge that military operations sometimes require accepting higher levels of risk to accomplish the mission. Sometimes. Thompson's eyebrows rose. Martinez, military operations always require accepting risk. That's what separates military service from civilian law enforcement. When you hesitate because you might hurt an innocent person, you guarantee that you'll get good people killed. The statement hung in the air like a verdict, and Sarah felt something inside her chest tighten painfully. She had joined the military to serve something larger than herself, to prove that she could meet any challenge and exceed any expectation. Instead, she was discovering that her fundamental approach to leadership might be incompatible with military requirements. The purpose of this exercise, Thompson continued, was to identify recruits who possess the tactical mindset and decision-making ability required for special operations support roles. Command Sergeant Major Harrison specifically requested to observe certain individuals who had shown exceptional promise during previous training phases. Sarah felt a chill run through her as she realized what Thompson was saying. She had been identified as a potential candidate for advanced military police assignments, but her performance during the exercise had disqualified her from consideration. Foster, Thompson said, consulting his clipboard again, your tactical assessment during the exercise was consistently accurate, and your willingness to challenge questionable leadership decisions demonstrates the kind of independent thinking we value in special operations environments. Congratulations, you've been selected for the Military Police Special Response Team Evaluation Program. Foster's face lit up with genuine surprise and pride. Thank you, Drill Sergeant. I won't let you down. Chun, Rodriguez, Thompson continued, your performance was professional and competent throughout the exercise. While your team's final outcome was unsuccessful, your individual contributions were noted and will be reflected in your permanent training records. Sarah waited for her own evaluation, knowing that it would be the most difficult part of an already painful experience. Martinez, Thompson said finally, his voice carrying a weight that suggested he understood the magnitude of what he was about to say. Your performance during this exercise demonstrates that you lack the tactical mindset necessary for special operations support roles. Your tendency to prioritize civilian protection over mission accomplishment, while admirable from a humanitarian perspective, is incompatible with the realities of military operations in hostile environments. The words felt like a physical blow, not just because of their professional implications, but because they challenged everything Sarah believed about herself and her potential for military service. She had worked so hard to prove herself worthy of advanced opportunities, and now she was being told that her fundamental approach to leadership was wrong. However, Thompson continued, and Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Your technical proficiency and dedication to training excellence remain outstanding. You will continue with standard military police training and can expect assignment to a conventional MP unit upon completion of your program. The hope died as quickly as it had appeared. A conventional MP assignment meant routine security duties, checking identification cards at base gates, and handling minor disciplinary issues. It was a respectable military occupation, but it was worlds away from the special operations support roles she had dreamed of pursuing. As the formal debriefing concluded and her team prepared to rejoin the larger group, Sarah felt a profound sense of loss. In the span of a single exercise, her military career had been fundamentally redirected, her self-confidence shattered, and her understanding of her own capabilities called into question. But even worse than the professional disappointment was the realization that Foster had been right. She had made the wrong choice, and that choice had revealed something about her character that she wasn't sure she could change. The question that would haunt her in the days to come was whether being the kind of person who hesitated to hurt innocents was a fatal flaw in a military leader, or whether the military's definition of correct decision-making was itself flawed. As they walked back toward the barracks, Foster made no effort to hide his satisfaction with the day's outcome. His selection for the Special Response Team Evaluation Program was exactly the kind of opportunity Sarah had hoped to earn for herself, and his vindication in the eyes of the instructors felt like a personal defeat for her. The rest of her military training would continue, but everything had changed. The path she had envisioned for herself, challenging assignments, elite units, opportunities to serve at the highest levels, had been closed off by a single moment of hesitation. What remained was the question of whether she could find a way to rebuild her confidence and create a new vision for her military service, or whether this failure would define the rest of her career. The weeks following the failed exercise passed in a blur of routine training exercises and administrative tasks that felt hollow after the intensity of what Sarah had experienced. Her classmates moved forward with their specialized training tracks, while she found herself relegated to standard military police procedures that seemed mundane compared to the advanced tactical training she had glimpsed. Foster's departure for the Special Response Team Evaluation Program was celebrated by several recruits who saw his selection as validation that hard work and tactical thinking were rewarded in the military. His final words to Sarah before leaving were delivered with the kind of professional courtesy that somehow felt worse than outright hostility. "Good luck with your career, Martinez," he said, extending his hand for a formal handshake. "I hope you find an assignment that matches your approach to leadership." The pause before approach to leadership made it clear that Foster considered her style fundamentally flawed, and Sarah shook his hand knowing that his assessment might be shared by many others in the military hierarchy. Thompson's treatment of Sarah in the aftermath of the exercise was perhaps the most difficult aspect of her new reality. Gone was the intense scrutiny and challenging assignments that had defined their relationship during her early training. Instead, he treated her with the kind of professional indifference reserved for recruits who had demonstrated competence but lacked exceptional potential. During group exercises, Sarah found herself assigned to routine roles that required technical proficiency, but offered no opportunity to demonstrate leadership ability. When Thompson provided additional training to selected recruits, Sarah was excluded from those sessions. Most painfully, when visiting instructors arrived to observe the training company, Thompson no longer suggested that Sarah be among the recruits selected for special evaluation. The change in her status was subtle but unmistakable, and it affected her relationships with her fellow recruits as well. Jessica Chun and Michael Rodriguez remained supportive friends, but even they seemed uncertain about how to navigate the new dynamic. Conversations that had once focused on shared ambitions for challenging military assignments now avoided the topic of future career plans altogether. New recruits arriving at the training facility quickly learned the social hierarchy that had developed within the company. Sarah found herself categorized as someone who had shown promise but failed to deliver when it mattered, a cautionary tale about the importance of decisiveness under pressure. The reputation followed her through every exercise and evaluation, creating a psychological burden that made it difficult to perform at her previous level. 3 weeks after the failed exercise, Sarah received notification that her next assignment had been determined. She was to report to Fort Lewis in Washington State upon completion of her training, where she would join the 42nd Military Police Company. The assignment was respectable but unremarkable, exactly the kind of conventional posting that Thompson had predicted during their debriefing. The notification included a brief description of her future duties: base security, vehicle inspections, patrol operations, and administrative support for the installation's law enforcement activities. Reading through the list, Sarah felt a profound sense of disconnection from the ambitions that had driven her to enlist in the first place. These were important responsibilities, but they were far from the challenging, high-stakes assignments she had imagined herself pursuing. That evening, Sarah found herself alone in the day room, staring at her assignment notification and wondering if she should simply accept that her military career would be defined by competence rather than excellence. The dream of serving alongside elite units, of proving that a young woman from East Los Angeles could excel in the military's most demanding roles, seemed childish now in the face of her demonstrated limitations. It was during this moment of solitary reflection that her life changed again, though she wouldn't understand the significance until much later. The day room door opened, and a man Sarah had never seen before entered with the confident stride of someone accustomed to belonging wherever he chose to go. He was tall and lean, with the kind of quiet intensity that immediately suggested military background, but his civilian clothes and longer hair indicated he was no longer on active duty. What struck Sarah most about the stranger was his eyes, sharp and assessing, but without the judgmental quality she had grown accustomed to seeing from military instructors. When his gaze found her sitting alone at the corner table, something shifted in his expression that she couldn't quite identify. "Evening," he said, approaching her table with a slight smile. "Mind if I join you? Looks like you could use some company." Sarah looked up from her assignment notification, momentarily uncertain about protocol. Visitors to the training facility were unusual, and she had no idea who this man might be or why he was approaching her specifically. "I'm not sure if," she began, but he gestured casually toward the empty chair across from her. "Relax," he said, settling into the chair without waiting for permission. "I'm not here in any official capacity. Name's Jake Morrison. I used to work around here, now I do different work." The introduction was deliberately vague, but something about Morrison's manner suggested that the vagueness was intentional rather than evasive. Sarah found herself relaxing slightly despite her uncertainty about the situation. "Sarah Martinez," she replied. "Are you here to see someone specific?" Morrison glanced at the assignment notification on the table, and Sarah realized he could probably read at least part of it from his position across from her. "Actually, I was here to see you. Mind if I ask how you're feeling about your next assignment?" The question caught Sarah off guard. Morrison spoke like someone who knew about her recent difficulties, but she couldn't imagine how a civilian visitor would have access to information about her training performance or career prospects. "It's a good assignment," she said carefully. "Fort Lewis has an excellent reputation." Morrison nodded thoughtfully, but his expression suggested he wasn't convinced by her diplomatic response. "Fort Lewis is a fine installation. 42nd MP Company does important work. But I get the sense that's not exactly what you had in mind when you enlisted." Sarah felt a flicker of defensiveness. "Every assignment is important. I'm looking forward to serving wherever the Army needs me." "That's the right answer," Morrison said with a slight smile. "But it's not really an answer to my question. What I'm wondering is whether you're satisfied with letting one bad exercise define the rest of your military career." The directness of the question surprised Sarah, and she found herself studying Morrison more carefully. His casual manner couldn't completely hide the intensity beneath it, and she was beginning to suspect that his presence here was no accident. "I don't know what you mean," she said, though they both knew that wasn't true. Morrison leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming more serious. "3 weeks ago, you participated in a stress evaluation exercise designed to identify candidates for special operations support roles. You made a tactical decision that prioritized civilian protection over immediate threat neutralization. Your team was eliminated from the exercise, and you were subsequently removed from consideration for advanced assignments." Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment as Morrison recited the details of her failure with clinical precision. "How do you know about that? That information should be classified." "I know about it because I was watching," Morrison replied simply. "I was there as an observer, evaluating the evaluation, you might say, and I saw something that the official assessment missed." The revelation that Morrison had been present during her most humiliating professional moment made Sarah want to end the conversation immediately. But something in his tone suggested that his perspective might be different from what she had heard from Thompson and the other instructors. "What could you have seen that trained military instructors missed?" she asked, genuine curiosity overcoming her embarrassment. Morrison was quiet for a moment, seeming to consider his words carefully. "Tell me something, Martinez. In the scenario where you hesitated to shoot, what were you thinking? Walk me through your actual decision-making process, not the official version you gave during the debrief." Sarah hesitated, uncertain whether she should share her true thoughts with someone who remained largely a mystery to her. But there was something about Morrison's manner that invited honesty, and she found herself describing her actual experience rather than the sanitized version she had provided to Thompson. "The figure between me and the primary threat looked young," she said slowly. "Couldn't tell if it was male or female, but the body language seemed scared rather than aggressive. I know the rules of engagement allow for engaging potential threats, but something about the situation didn't feel right. I thought if I could get a better angle or force the figure to reveal their intentions, I could avoid potentially shooting a terrified teenager. Morrison nodded as she spoke, his expression thoughtful rather than judgmental. What happened in those 2 seconds while you were analyzing the situation? I was looking for indicators, Sarah continued, warming to the subject despite herself. Hand positions, movement patterns, anything that would tell me whether I was looking at a threat or a victim. I was also calculating alternative approaches. Could I reposition for a cleaner shot? Could I use verbal commands to control the situation? Was there a way to protect the potential civilian while still neutralizing the threat? And when the situation deteriorated, what was your immediate response? Sarah thought back to the chaos of those final moments. I tried to engage both targets simultaneously while calling for my team to take cover. But by then it was too late. They had the tactical advantage, and we were caught in a crossfire. Morrison leaned forward slightly, his intensity increasing. So, in 2 seconds, you assessed multiple threats, calculated civilian casualty risk, considered alternative tactical approaches, and attempted to create a solution that protected both your team and potential innocents. When that approach failed, you immediately shifted to damage control while maintaining your responsibility for your team's safety. Sarah stared at him, confused by his apparent approval of decision-making that had been universally criticized by her instructors. But I made the wrong choice. My hesitation got my team killed. According to the exercise parameters, yes, Morrison agreed. But exercises are artificial constructs designed to test specific criteria. The real question is whether your decision-making process demonstrates the kind of thinking that's valuable in actual operational environments. The conversation was beginning to feel surreal. After weeks of being told that her performance had been fundamentally flawed, Morrison was suggesting that there might have been merit in her approach. I don't understand, Sarah said. Every instructor I've spoken with has emphasized that hesitation in combat situations is fatal. They're not wrong about that. Morrison smiled, and for the first time, Sarah saw something in his expression that looked like genuine respect. They're absolutely right about hesitation being potentially fatal. But what you did wasn't hesitation, it was rapid tactical analysis under pressure. The difference is significant, and most people don't have the training to recognize it. Sarah felt a flicker of hope, followed immediately by skepticism. If that's true, why didn't any of my instructors see it that way? Because your instructors were evaluating you against the wrong criteria, Morrison replied. They were looking for someone who could follow established tactical procedures under pressure, which is important for conventional military police operations. But the kind of rapid analysis and creative problem-solving you demonstrated is exactly what we need for more specialized work. The word "we" caught Sarah's attention immediately. Who's we? Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if making some kind of internal calculation. That depends on whether you're interested in finding out. But first, I need to know if you're ready to stop seeing your performance in that exercise as a failure and start seeing it as evidence that you think differently than most people. Sarah felt her heart rate increasing as she began to understand that this conversation was leading toward some kind of opportunity she hadn't anticipated. I'm not sure I understand what you're offering. I'm not offering anything yet, Morrison replied. I'm assessing whether you have the mental flexibility to reconsider your understanding of your own capabilities. Because if you're going to spend the rest of your career believing that caring about civilian casualties makes you weak, then you're not someone we need. The challenge in his words sparked something in Sarah that had been dormant since her failure in the exercise. For weeks, she had accepted the assessment that her tactical thinking was flawed, that her instincts were wrong for military service. But Morrison was suggesting that her approach might be valuable in contexts she hadn't considered. What kind of work are you talking about? She asked. Morrison smiled again, and Sarah realized that her question had revealed exactly what he had been hoping to hear. The kind of work where getting the mission accomplished matters less than getting it accomplished the right way. Where protecting innocence isn't a complication to be managed, but the primary objective to be achieved. As Morrison spoke, Sarah felt a fundamental shift in her understanding of her recent experiences. Perhaps her failure in the exercise hadn't revealed a flaw in her character, but rather a mismatch between her values and the specific requirements of conventional military operations. Perhaps there were other ways to serve that would value rather than penalize her instinct to protect the innocent. Morrison's words hung in the air between them, and Sarah felt the weight of possibility settling over her like a new understanding of who she might become. But before she could respond, the day room door opened again, and Thompson entered with the measured stride that had become so familiar during her training. His reaction to finding Sarah in conversation with Morrison was immediate and complex surprise, recognition, and something that might have been concern all flickered across his features before settling into professional neutrality. "Morrison," Thompson said, nodding toward the civilian. "Didn't expect to see you back here so soon." "Thompson," Morrison replied, rising from his chair with the easy confidence of someone comfortable with authority figures. "Just having a conversation with one of your graduates." Sarah noticed the careful language both men used, polite but formal, suggesting a relationship that was professional but not necessarily friendly. She also noticed that Thompson's attention kept shifting to her, as if trying to assess what kind of conversation he had interrupted. "Martinez," Thompson said, addressing Sarah directly, "I need to speak with you about your final evaluation scores." "Morrison, I'm sure you understand." The dismissal was polite but unmistakable, and Sarah felt a stab of disappointment. Just as she had begun to understand that there might be alternatives to the conventional military career path that had been mapped out for her, the conversation was being terminated. But Morrison didn't seem concerned by Thompson's obvious desire to end their interaction. "Actually, Thompson, I think Martinez should hear what you have to say about her evaluation. Might be relevant to our discussion." There was something in Morrison's tone that suggested he knew exactly what Thompson's evaluation contained, and that he expected it to support whatever point he had been making to Sarah. Thompson's expression shifted to something approaching wariness. "This isn't the appropriate time or place for that conversation," Thompson said, his tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "When would be appropriate?" Morrison asked, and Sarah detected a challenge beneath his casual manner. "After she's already been shipped off to Fort Lewis? After she spent 6 months doing routine security checks, while wondering what she could have accomplished if someone had recognized her actual potential." The exchange was clearly about more than just scheduling, and Sarah found herself caught between two strong personalities who seemed to be negotiating some kind of unspoken agreement about her future. She was beginning to understand that her performance in the exercise had attracted attention from sources beyond her immediate chain of command. Thompson glanced around the day room, confirming that they were alone before making what appeared to be a reluctant decision. "Fine. But this stays between the three of us until official channels have been followed." He moved to the chair Morrison had vacated and settled into it with the careful precision that characterized all his actions. "Martinez, your final evaluation scores are going to be complicated." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. After weeks of believing that her scores would reflect her poor performance in the exercise, she wasn't prepared for ambiguity. "Your technical proficiency scores are among the highest in your training company," Thompson continued. "Your physical fitness scores are excellent. Your academic performance has been consistently outstanding. But your tactical decision-making evaluation contains significant reservations about your suitability for high-pressure military police operations." Each positive point felt undermined by the final criticism, and Sarah found herself once again confronting the fundamental question of whether her instincts were compatible with military service. "However," Thompson said, and Sarah noticed Morrison lean forward slightly in his chair, "your evaluation also contains notations that certain observers found your analytical approach under pressure to be distinctive." Sarah looked between Thompson and Morrison, trying to understand what was being communicated through careful language and meaningful glances. "Distinctive how?" she asked. Thompson consulted a folder he had brought with him, though Sarah suspected he knew its contents by heart. "The official language is that you demonstrated unconventional tactical thinking that prioritizes comprehensive threat assessment over immediate action." The assessment notes that this approach may be valuable in specialized operational contexts requiring enhanced discrimination between hostile and non-hostile elements. Sarah felt her confusion deepening. The language Thompson was using sounded almost positive, which was completely contrary to everything she had been told about her performance. Morrison spoke into her silence. What Thompson is trying to tell you, in the most diplomatic way possible, is that some people recognize that your performance in the exercise wasn't a failure. It was evidence of a different kind of tactical thinking that's valuable for different kinds of missions. Thompson's expression suggested that he wasn't entirely comfortable with Morrison's direct translation of the official assessment, but he didn't contradict it. "What kind of missions?" Sarah asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew the answer. "Missions where the primary objective is protecting people rather than eliminating threats," Morrison replied. "Missions where understanding local populations, minimizing civilian casualties, and building trust are more important than overwhelming firepower. Missions where the wrong choice isn't hesitating to shoot. It's shooting when you should have found another way." As Morrison spoke, Sarah felt something inside her chest begin to loosen, a tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying since the exercise. For weeks, she had been trying to reconcile her instinctive approach to problem-solving with the military's apparent requirement for immediate decisive action. The possibility that both approaches might be valuable in different contexts had never occurred to her. "Are you talking about special operations?" she asked. "I'm talking about a specific type of special operations," Morrison replied. "The kind where success is measured not by how efficiently you can eliminate threats, but by how effectively you can accomplish objectives while maintaining the moral authority that gives those objectives meaning." Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Morrison, you're getting ahead of yourself. Martinez hasn't even completed her training cycle yet." "Her training cycle ends in 2 weeks," Morrison replied. "Which means we have 2 weeks to determine whether she's interested in a different path than the one that's currently been planned for her." Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she began to understand that this conversation was leading towards some kind of specific opportunity. "What kind of path?" Morrison looked at Thompson, who nodded reluctantly. "There's a program," Morrison said carefully, "that recruits military personnel with specific psychological profiles for assignments that require enhanced cultural sensitivity and ethical decision-making under pressure. The program is selective." The careful language told Sarah that whatever Morrison was describing was classified at a level that required deliberate vagueness, even in private conversation. "What does the program involve?" she asked. "Training that emphasizes everything your current instructors have been telling you is wrong," Morrison replied with a slight smile. "How to analyze complex situations rapidly without losing sight of humanitarian considerations. How to accomplish military objectives while maintaining relationships with local populations. How to make tactical decisions that serve larger strategic goals rather than just immediate tactical advantage." Sarah felt a surge of excitement that she tried to keep from showing on her face. Everything Morrison was describing sounded like a validation of her natural instincts rather than a requirement to suppress them. "Why me?" she asked. "What makes you think I'd be suitable for this kind of work?" Morrison's expression became serious. "Because in that exercise 3 weeks ago, when everyone else was focused on whether you could follow standard tactical procedures, you were trying to solve a more complex problem. You were trying to figure out how to accomplish the mission while staying true to values that matter more than just winning." Thompson leaned forward. "Martinez, you need to understand that this conversation is highly irregular. Morrison's program operates outside normal military channels, and accepting his offer would mean leaving conventional military police training for something that carries significant risks as well as opportunities." Sarah looked between the two men, trying to process the magnitude of what was being offered. After weeks of believing her military career had been irreparably damaged by a single poor decision, she was being told that the same decision might qualify her for opportunities she had never imagined. "What happens if I say yes?" she asked. "You complete your current training as scheduled," Morrison replied. "But instead of reporting to Fort Lewis, you report to a different facility for additional evaluation and specialized training. If you successfully complete that program, you'll be assigned to units that work in environments where your particular approach to tactical thinking is considered an asset rather than a liability." And if I say no, you report to Fort Lewis as planned, Thompson said. You serve with distinction in conventional military police operations, and you have a successful military career doing important work. Sarah realized that both options represented legitimate paths to meaningful military service. The choice wasn't between success and failure, but between two different definitions of what success might look like. Can I ask what kind of work the program prepares people for? She said. Morrison was quiet for a moment before responding. Work that takes place in communities where military personnel need to be seen as protectors rather than occupiers. Work where building trust is more important than projecting strength. Work where the tactical situation changes not based on enemy actions, but based on the relationships you build with people who are caught between competing forces. As Morrison spoke, Sarah understood that he was describing exactly the kind of military service she had imagined when she first decided to enlist: opportunities to serve as a bridge between military power and civilian communities, to use her training in service of values that extended beyond purely tactical considerations. When do you need an answer? She asked. Take the time you need, Morrison replied, rising from his chair. But understand that opportunities like this don't come along often. And understand that accepting it means committing to a path that will challenge everything you think you know about military service. Thompson also stood, gathering his folder. Martinez, this decision will define your entire military career. Make sure you're choosing for the right reasons. As both men prepared to leave, Sarah felt the weight of possibility settling over her once again. The conversation had fundamentally changed her understanding of her recent experiences and opened possibilities she had never considered. But it had also presented her with a choice that would determine not just her career path, but her understanding of how her values could be expressed through military service. After they left, Sarah sat alone in the day room, staring at her Fort Lewis assignment notification and wondering whether it represented a settlement for adequate service or simply one option among several. For the first time since the failed exercise, she allowed herself to imagine that her approach to tactical thinking might be not just acceptable, but actively valuable. The question that remained was whether she was ready to bet her military career on the possibility that someone like Morrison was right about her potential, or whether the safer path of conventional service represented the wisdom of accepting her demonstrated limitations. As she sat in an empty day room, Sarah realized that the wrong choice she had made 3 weeks ago might have been exactly the right choice to reveal who she really was and what she was capable of becoming. The Navy SEAL who had stepped forward wasn't just Morrison. It was the part of herself that refused to accept that protecting innocence was a weakness rather than a strength. The drill that had nearly broken her spirit was becoming the foundation for a completely different understanding of what it meant to serve. And for the first time since enlisting, Sarah felt that the path forward might lead exactly where she had always hoped to go, toward a way of serving that honored both her training and her values. The choice was hers to make, and this time she was determined to make it right.